So here is one set of answers as to how somebody sees the discipline changing. And I'm giving you a European perspective. I'll come to my own perspective later. And I'm really sort of talking about François Hartog in France with his book on regimes of historicity, where he argues that, at least in Europe, history for a long time was really about studying the past in order to find examples in it of behavior that kings and nobles and the elite could follow. And the assumption of that was that the world really didn't change that much. So history was not a study of change. History was a study of how people behaved in certain circumstances in a world that itself didn't change that much, so that you could learn from people 1,000 years ago, right? Moral behavior or heroic behavior or courageous behavior. Or, like in Machiavelli, just, pragmatic, consequentialist behavior. And Hartog then says that this changed for Europeans once they found the New World. And once they went to the Americas, and you could say that this is a phase that continues from the opening up of the New World in the Americas to the Pacific, suddenly history became more an awareness of the ways in which the world has changed. And therefore the future became an open vista that was not going to be like the present, right? So the idea that the past was different from the present would be different from the future, it sort of created the basis for history becoming a study of change. And that's what happened in the 19th century. It became a study of change. And then his argument was, but this open vision of future that Europeans had collapsed in the 20th century because of the two wars. So it was almost like the future had collapsed into the present. And that's what he thinks gave rise in Europe to the study of memory and other kinds of, not history, but alternative histories, which he regards as presentism. So he has this threefold distinction, and he thinks, but what he tells is a European story. It's not necessarily a Eurocentric story, but a European story. Whereas if you look at if, for instance, if you go with Hartog and say that yes, at the end of the Second World War, maybe the future collapsed back into the present in Europe, that's not what happened in all the countries that emerged in the wake of decolonization in the 50s and 60s, last century. And those countries were actually, they looked at the US and the Soviet Union as examples of modernization, development, progress, and visions of the future. So actually history became very important too. So even if the European argument is right that the 20th century really was about, after the mid-20th century was about the decline of history, then I would say that it was also about the rise of history, big time, in both American and Soviet visions, induced visions of modernization, progress, and the way in which, as you know, washing machines, Frigidaires, these household consumption goods in the 50s and 60s were sold as bringing women emancipation, progress, etc. So I think history had a second life, even that kind of history, and in these countries. But then what happened was, the third phase I saw in history, and this is what brings us to the present situation, was really a democratization, even of that history, post-60s, partly through the decolonization process, but partly through the rise of disadvantaged and marginal groups who all sought to find a place for themselves in the stories of nations, right? And that's indigenous history and Dalit history in India, subaltern history, all those kinds of history, women's histories, and race histories. But what happened in the process, when people and groups that were not recorded in history, people without histories, in Eric Poole's terms, sought to find a place in historical representation, they found that the existing archives didn't always acknowledge them. And that required the hunt for other kinds of sources, oral history, memory studies. And of course, when you go into oral history and memory studies, you realize that you are not simply supplementing history, you're also supplanting it. You're creating something else, right? And so I would say that we left the last century at this juncture where the European sense of history, which created disciplines and departments throughout the world, had sort of exhausted itself, right? And there was, but history again became dominant and important in the new societies, including the new societies of the United States and the Soviet Union, giving rise to then a democratization of history, producing the need to imagine alternative kind of sources for writing of history, and that resulting in actually forms of histories, imaginations of histories that didn't always accord with what a traditional disciplinary historian would call history, right? And that left us with identity politics, with the demand that my experience is my testimony is my history. All of those things that from a traditional point of view would seem problematic, but on the other hand, which were signs of democratic winds blowing through the corridors of history. I personally think that in the present century, the discipline of history has had another challenge in both senses. That it's been challenged by certain new developments, and I'm sure it will respond to those challenges. And it's in the process of responding to those challenges, which have come about through our increasing sense that what was recognized from the 1970s on as ecological crisis has actually taken on global planetary proportions, big time, with climate change, water scarcity, everywhere, food security, and all of those things. Now, this has given rise to the call for deep history and big history. And David Armitage and Joe Gould's book, but there are other sort of responses like that, deep history and big history. And I think, so this is not traditional, even not traditional environmental history as we used to imagine it from the 1970s. This is kind of taking on sometimes the geological past of the planet, sometimes the biological past of the planet, and setting the human story in that context, setting the story of capitalism in that context. Now, I would say that the discipline is in the process of responding to it. See, in the last 2 decades of the last century, historians responded to the theme of globalization by producing global history and world history. It's a very exciting moment for studying history because new things are happening and the discipline is changing, and it might just be timely to come into history and see how it's changing.